Hello, everybody. This is Gary York, True Prison Stories, and today I'm very excited about an interview that we're going to have today with Anthony Gangi from Tear Talk. Many of you that are on my channel know of him already, and those of you that don't, you can see his hat right there, Tear Talk. You can subscribe to his YouTube channel anytime, any day, and get a lot of interesting educational, correctional videos from Tear Talk. Now, today we're going to talk about something special. Anthony Gangi is an 18-year prison system veteran, and he's worked his way up the ranks, and he has a new book out called Inmate Manipulation Decoded. And I'm going to tell you right now, Anthony, can you hold that book up for us so we can see that book and kind of leave it there while I talk for a minute? Thank you. A definitive guide to understanding the inmate manipulation process. Now, I really love the cover because if you raise it a little higher, this cover is really cool. I really like the message it sends. To me, it sent a message the minute I saw it. There's a chess match going on right there, okay, folks? There's an inmate and an officer. Now, what that means is the manipulation game is like a chess match, and every person that works behind the prison walls needs to read this book, because I don't care if you're in uniform or you're a nurse or whatever. This book is very important to read because inmates will play a chess game with you and try to manipulate you. And we're going to let Anthony tell us, of course, why he wrote the book and what he wants people to get from the book. But manipulation is such a serious concern. And this book will give you a guide on how not to get manipulated. And I recommend this book to everybody. So, Anthony, without further ado, I want to congratulate you on your new release. It's #1 today on new releases in a couple of categories, folks. #1 in new releases in a couple of categories. Let's make it #1 overall, folks, by ordering this book. Okay, Anthony, tell us why you wrote the book and what you want people to get out of it.
All right, so real quick, even with the picture, I like what you noticed. So it's actually the officers playing checkers and the inmates playing chess. So you have a game of reaction, which is checkers, a game of strategy, which is the chess part. And that was when I mentioned that to the editor, I couldn't believe that he was able to help me get that picture because that's how important that picture is. So real quick, writing this book, I believe had to be done because I don't think it's taken as serious as it should be. I think a lot of people sit there and they focus on the outcome, what's being brought in, but there's a process. So at the end of the day, if I see an officer and I say, wow, that officer's got to be a fool for bringing in a phone, well, that's the outcome. The process is a lot more complex. And what I wanted to do was, first, when I wrote this book, I actually had to convince people that it could happen to you. So not only is the book about, defending yourself, of course, and letting people know of the strategies that inmates play. And by the way, guys, when we talk about strategies, we're talking about strategies that are based on persuasion and manipulation that are utilized, I know, outside in the real world, outside in businesses, but I was able to apply that in this book and basically take those theories, tell you what those theories are about, and then apply that to my interactions and when I felt the conflict, because that's the key, guys. The book really focuses on self-awareness and have an understanding of the situations that you're in. And I think by knowing who you are in this profession, knowing who you are during these interactions, you start to understand the conflicts that you feel that maybe could be, okay, what's this inmate really trying to get at? Because at the end of the day, these are strategies that are employed that are step by step by step by step that you don't even know you're going down the path until finally, and Gary, you know this from being an investigator, I'm sure there are some people that you put in handcuffs that were really shocked when they got caught because maybe their intent was never to be a corrupt officer, but it got to the point where it happened because the inmate was able to maneuver.
Yes. That's a great point. There were some people that I actually felt really bad for. They had been great correctional officers or great prison employees on the civilian side, 15, 16, 17, 18 years. And then next thing you know, they're across the table from me. They did not even see it coming. They didn't catch the signs of the inmate manipulating them. And they may have lost their job, and not even criminally. They may have just lost their job because they slipped up, took a letter, took a card for the inmate, whatever. But administratively, they still lost their job. We're not even talking criminal issues here. You know, we do have some folks that have been taken in on criminal charges that were manipulated, but they also knew what they were doing in some cases was very wrong. But how many administrative cases do you see where a good officer and you're like, oh my God, I just can't believe it, you know, that they fell for that inmate trap, I call it.
Well, I was shocked over one of my partners back in the day that when I found out, I was shocked that people like, well, you know, usually you would know because that was your partner. Not if you're a good officer. Because sometimes when you're a good officer, that officer may not do it in front of you. You know, so all because I worked next to somebody for years, if I'm highly professional, they may not do the unprofessional things in front of me. So, you know, most of the time when people say, well, you knew you worked with this partner for years. Yeah, but I'm a professional officer and they would be on point with me. So I don't always think that you always know. And for this case here, this person I saw was a professional, but unfortunately, there were times when they weren't, and that's what caught them. And you know, even when it comes to this book, like there's 9 chapters in the book. I kept things short. You know, basically, this is what the theory is. This is how it applies, and then move on to the next topic. And then in the process, while I'm talking about the story, I also discuss things that, you know, you could have done during the way to prevent it. And the chapters, how I broke them down, just real quick, is 9 chapters. They go anywhere from insight and situational awareness, controlling the dialogue. We do discuss downing a duck, but I do recommend that you read that on your own before you read chapter 3, because we do focus on when Downing a Duck was written, it talks about it from the inmate's perspective. I'm going to give it to you from the officer's perspective and how he felt during that process. We also talk about authority and social validation, which is basically how inmates can steal our perception of authority. Because, by the way, our authority is the perception. It's not, you can't rely on the uniform to give you that level of authority. That's on you. You know, that's how you are. And I talk about how supervisors can support that, how peers can support it, or how they may not realize they're not supporting it, which is like for a supervisor, an inmate circumventing the rules. You know, well, Gangi just said no, I'll go to Gary York, who's going to say yes, he's a supervisor. Well, you go, by the inmate going behind my back, you just took the authority from me if you go ahead and change my no to a yes. And by the way, during all these topics, we enforce communication because inmates look for inconsistency. So if we're communicating with each other, there's no inconsistency. There's no shopping for staff. A no from Gangi is a no from Gary. And even if, let's say, Gangi made a mistake and Gary's the supervisor, Gary can still give it back to Gangi so he can still maintain the authority. Gangi can fix it. Then I talk about scarcity, obligations, and reliance. That's a scary part. Sometimes you will have officers that have good time in, perfect career, and they make that foolish mistake. And it's not so much about what happened into the prison. It's more about maybe something that happened on the outside that puts pressure, and the inmates find out about it, like a divorce, and the person's in desperation mode, and the inmates come out with their one-time offer. And we also talk about obligation, the favor, the tit for tat, but reliance too, which was discovered on the way. Inmates love when you rely on them. So sometimes we have a lot, just an example, we have a lot of facilities that are run by labor, inmate labor. And you have inmates that purposely are good at what they do so we can become dependent on them. So they're not seen as irreplaceable. And sometimes what they don't realize is that the more we praise these inmates about the good work they do, the more they're like, well, you know what? They need me. And what they'll do is they'll take advantage of it. And the first time I noticed it is when, we have a plumbing problem. This inmate, I got to write him up. And next thing you know, my supervisor's telling me, yo, but he's our plumber. We need him. I was like, so we're relying on this person. And then the other things we touch on real quick is, does the gender of staff change with the game? And And by the way, the last two chapters are just thoughts of survival. Let me run something by you that I think is interesting, because this wasn't originally part of the book. I was having a dialogue with Connie, and we were exploring inmate manipulation from female inmates to male officers and male inmates to female officers, right? So again, nothing's ever 100%, but sometimes you do got to throw out things in generality, because it's going to apply, but there's always going to be exception to the rules, right? But for the most part, and the reason what makes me, why I think I was able to come out with this book that's unique is I'm very empathetic. I like to pretend I'm that person going through it because that's where you learn. You have to learn. And it also holds responsibility to the players, right? So like, if I'm able to understand the game, I'm also putting, okay, this is the person responsible for the game, and seeing the person being manipulated as a victim, not to minimize the result, but just to, this is a game being played. It can happen to anyone. So this is what we learned. The book was almost pretty much in completion. Me and Connie had a dialogue. And as we were discussing something, and I like this chapter a lot, this chapter 7, because it's a new discovery for me. So here's what the thought was. So if I'm a male inmate and I work at a female facility, and guys, if you're watching the show, just take heed of this. Female inmates are going to push their physicality because they know we're men. It is what it is. And it's believe it or not, guys, they can tell too if you're attracted to them because, your body language, you looking for their attention without even realizing you're looking for their attention, where you look or where you obviously don't look, so what happens here is that female inmates are willing to give over a level of control to make that male feel dominant and in power. And by the way, even though you may be having that sexual act with that inmate, which you may think the female's submissive, they're in total control. Don't think for one moment they're not in total control. They're in total control, but they're going to give you the perception that you are in the control. And that's what kind of works for men. They think they're in control. And, they think they got this female inmate. And at the end of the day, you're being played the whole time. The person that's really in control is the female inmate. And one of the things we discovered that's put in this book is when you have that dialogue with that male officer, because sometimes these male officers, they be, man, if that girl wasn't locked up and all this other stuff, and you're sitting here like, so you're saying if the girl wasn't locked up, what? Come on, Gans, you got, if she wasn't. Yeah, but the funny thing is, so if there wasn't consequences to your actions, you would hit that, right? You would have sex with that female. Yeah, but there's consequences. Yeah, but consequences isn't the reasons why you wouldn't do it. Consequences, inmates can minimize that. Think about this. If I'm an inmate and I give you that level of control, I'm minimizing the consequence. So when I start to minimize the consequence, then all of a sudden that protection that you have, that, man, I would not want, obviously I can't have sex with her because, she's locked up and, she's in prison. Yeah, but that's not the reason why, brother. The reason why is because you're a fucking professional and you know what's wrong. Now, with that said, once they minimize the consequences, all of a sudden, now that protection that you had, like the consequences stopping you, well, that's the females. I'm going to minimize the consequences and it opens up the door, but I'm going to give you the power. Now, the reverse for a female officer to male inmate, a male inmate will show that they can protect the female, will try to get the female to be reliant on them. And by the way, a female will be more willing to give up the power to that male inmate for the protection and the love and loyalty that they're getting in return. And that whole chapter is covered in chapter 7. And guys, nothing's 100%. So obviously there's some people that could fall in, but for the most part, having that dialogue and having that discussion with Connie, I thought it was enough to put that in the book. But yeah, I thought that was definitely a good discovery. Would you agree, Guy? I don't know if first time we discussed it.
I want to tell you something. Chapter 7 really interests me. The whole book interests me, but chapter 7, I think, is the first time I've ever heard it described in this way, and it's really good because in 12 years as a senior prison inspector, I did a lot of investigations on staff-inmate relationship. Some obviously were not true, and there were false allegations, and we cleared the officer. But unfortunately, truth is the truth. Many of them were substantiated either by letters, pictures, DNA, whatever the case may be. And that chapter, as an investigator that had to investigate a lot of these cases, that chapter is really intriguing to me, and that chapter excites me, and that's very good. And I'm going to tell you, I don't care if you're just starting in the academy, you're thinking about being a correctional officer, you're a 25-year veteran or a 5-year veteran, you need to take heed to what was just explained here about chapter 7. They're very tricky, these inmates. And then prior to chapter 7, you describe something, and I'll just say one thing. We've always had that saying, don't ever forget they are inmates. You know, we're building this building, and he is a professional bricklayer on the outside. We have to have him for the structure of this building to be correct. But now we catch him with dope. Well, we're not going to keep him on that project, I hope, because he's needed for the construction. We need to punish him just like we would anybody else. Never forget they're inmates. A lot of people sometimes drop that guard when they're on those work projects like you described, Anthony, and they now don't see them as an inmate. They see them as a co-worker. And that's something we got to stay away from.
Yeah, you know what's funny? There's a couple of things that I also mentioned in the book. So if you think about what you just mentioned right now, it's great because one thing is you're going to have obligation there because this person's a great worker. We feel we owe them, right? Which technically we don't. They're an inmate, right? You also become reliant on them. And look at the situation with the plumbing concern. I'm also desperate. So think about that. Desperate, reliance, obligation. You know, who has control there? And that's mentioned in the book. You know, the control goes to the inmate 100%. And sometimes inmates become good at what they do for that reason. So you can either, you know, hey, remember that time I did you that favor late at night when you had the plumbing issue, or I was the only one that can come out. And basically you just showed that you're relying on me. And reliance to me is also a level of trust. So now the agency has put me in a position where I have to trust this inmate, you know? And then also the sad thing is that the inmate's wrong and I'm an officer, I choose to write the inmate up. And the supervisor takes my authority and says, no, you can't because I need them. You just franchised me. Now I'm going to vent to other staff and you're going to wind up having other staff that's like, you know what? We're not even going to write this guy up no more, you know, because he's just going to beat the charge. So now as a supervisor, look what you just did. You have a whole unit that's going to have no control. And again, it's the obligation, the reliance, the desperation. Another thing we talk about in the book that I think you would find definitely interesting is, do we believe in our directives that we give? So when we give an inmate a directive, some inmates are going to try to ask us those whys, especially if they don't agree with the directive. And they'll even shop for staff to get what they want. Now, not that we have to justify it to an inmate. If I tell an inmate no, it's a no. I don't have to justify it to you. But I do want to justify it to myself to make sure that I believe in the directive that's being said. And I in my research here, again, just on my own and my own experiences, I've noticed there's two types of justifications that we provide. One's external, one's internal. So just to give you an example, if I have a inmate that's eating in the day room, and that's a rule that, you know, we really don't want. So I go to the inmate and I say, hey, you can't eat in the day room, right? And the inmate's like, why? Now, I don't have to justify it to the inmate, but let's just say I feel like I have to say something, which again, I don't. I could say, one, because the sergeant doesn't like it, which is an external response, which is weak. Because if the sergeant's not there, the inmate's going to eat. Or I could say, because I said no. And if the inmate says, why? Because I said no. Broken record. I said no. The inmate cannot maneuver because they're looking for a weakness in the justification. There's also another story, Gary, about a love letter. There was an inmate that wrote a love letter to an officer. And again, this is in the book. And she did turn it in. Everything this officer did was correct. Don't get me wrong. But the inmate went to her and pretty much said, like, why would you do that? I did nothing wrong. And she goes, you wrote me a love letter. He goes, but I did nothing wrong. She goes, yes, writing a love letter is against the rules, against policy and procedure. So the inmate's probably thinking, well, if it wasn't for policy and procedure, we could be together. That's their mindset. So that's an external response. What you should have said was, because I disagree with it. You know, same thing with the officer we mentioned before. So you wouldn't have sex with that inmate because of the consequences. But if the consequences weren't there, you would. So now what I'm trying to get the person to say is, why wouldn't you have sex with that inmate? Because it's not right. That's not what I'm here to do. That, you know, I have good value. I have good. That's what's going to hold you through things when inmates try to minimize the consequences to get you to see past that and to commit the act that ultimately they wind up getting the leverage on. And that external answers, they're weak guys. That's why when you give out those directives, you have to make sure you believe in those directives yourself. I don't care how you know, it's more about how you justify it to yourself. Do you believe in the no that you're given? Because if you don't, it's not going to come across to the inmates, and they will challenge you until they find that weakness.
Yes, be strong, be consistent, be solid. And just like you said, don't give the inmate any kind of ammunition to use against you or to try to manipulate you into twisting it around. You're the officer. That's the inmate. Tell them what you want. Don't need to give them reasons and 1,000 explanations why. I just hate it when you see an officer standing in a dorm or in a pod at the jail or a dorm at the prison, and you walk in and you see the officer explaining and answering all the inmates' questions. I just get so, it's like I go like this. No, you know, you have to go get that officer, say, come here, and pull that officer to the side and say, look, I'm not doing this to be a smart ass. I'm not doing this because I think I know more than you. Stop giving that inmate 1,000 excuses and reasons why you want them to do it. They're going to do it. You tell them to do it and be done. And I understand why you put that in there. And that's so important that officers need to learn that.
You know, Gary, I even have in the book about controlling the dialogue. The person asking the questions technically is the one in control. One of the other things we talk about that I think is interesting is, and again, what I do is I say what the theory is and do one scenario. Now, you guys can apply it. If you guys have experience, you can apply this. The initial scenarios are for those rookies, but for the most part, the stuff that's put here, you can make this into your own story. If I ever do a volume 2, because these theories are evergreen, I'll just change some of the personalized stories, you know. But there's another thing we talk about, because inmates want to take you out of your prescribed role, and they do that by how you label them. Obviously, trustee is never a good word, because that means I can trust you, right? So for those departments that are shifting away from can't call them an inmate, yeah, but that could be our defense to remind us of what our role is. I think of that person as an inmate, I'm reminded that I'm dealing with custody. It's the priority of that role that matters. And inmates want to they want you to like them, because it's harder for you to say no to someone you like. So what they'll do is they'll find similarities. Now, one of the things we mentioned in the book, which was a wake-up call for a senior staff member of mine, a friend of mine, William Young, who loved this part of the book, was we were talking about sports. And sometimes people think it's great to have small talk to kind of keep the day going. And I understand that. I understand, because you got to survive through the day. But the small talk should never reflect anything personal. You know, even if it's just a simple sports game where they can discover you like football in general, or you like the Giants. So in this scenario here, and by the way, guys, true story, there was an officer that was a very big fan of the Giants. And it was obvious this person was a fan of the Giants. Everybody that talked to him knew this person was a fan of the Giants, right? So eventually what happens here is certain inmates find out that this guy likes the Giants, and you have an inmate that never watched football before, you know, just never cared, but all of a sudden he starts ordering stuff related to football, but specifically also the Giants. Now, the amount of time inmates have, he's reading up on everything, right? Now, this is an icebreaker for him. So when the officer starts coming onto you, they start, you know, getting that small talk, Giants start to come up. And next thing you know, pretty much every day, this officer and his inmate are talking about the Giants, football, and all this other stuff. And it's funny because later on, when you did a search of his room, you would find that this inmate had a overwhelming amount of Giant stuff, but they were recent purchases, right? So as they have this dialogue, when you're a supervisor, you walk by the unit, you could see that this dialogue is got the officer's attention because everything else is happening around him and he's not seeing it. You know, the contraband, the visiting each other's cells, just very sloppy, but he's engaged in this dialogue. So first sign of a no-no is outside of this, because now, mind you, to this officer, this is not an inmate no more. This is a friend. This is a fan of the Giants. It's everything but an inmate. So one day, the big red flag here is that the officer's at home with his family, spending time with his loved ones away from work. The Giants win a game, and the first thing this guy's thinking, I can't wait to tell inmate Smith that the Giants won. You know, so right there, you're thinking of the guy when you're home. They have this dialogue. Next thing you know, the inmate kind of starts asking the officer about the Giants and about the next game and who do you think's going to win and all this other stuff. So the officer, of course, is talking about the Giants and, the Giants are going to win. They got this QB, they got this, they got that. The other team's got this and this. So eventually what happens here, the inmate, and I write this in the book, either did something foolish or smart. You guys be the judge of this, but he made a bet and he lost. And he lost big. So when the officer came in back to work, the inmate expressed, yo, remember all that shit you told me the other day? Well, the Giants lost, and now I made some bets, and they're coming after me. And now, mind you, to this officer, this ain't an inmate no more. This is my boy. This is my Giants fan. So now this inmate is trying to hold the officer responsible for the bet. I didn't tell you to bet. That's one thing, but the officer's not seeing that. All the officer is seeing is that, well, I gave him this advice. He's my friend. So eventually, to kind of speed it up, the officer, in order to help pay off the debt, snuck in contraband and got arrested. Now, the funny thing is that when everybody looks at this story, all they see on the surface is an officer brought in contraband. But how many people are willing to go back to say, wow, this started because they talked about the Giants? It's the game. It's the process.
Right. I mean, you see in the news or you see in the newspaper that he got arrested or anybody that gets arrested, but where did it all start? There's a huge, long trail and a long story that goes with it before you see those headlines come out. And you're absolutely right. And something as simple as sports, hunting, any kind of thing that you're interested in could be your downfall with that inmate.
Yeah, and again, when it comes to the book, I mean, that's what it is. We explore the process. At the end of the day, the outcomes are going to vary. It depends on who you are and what you're in the position to get. I mean, it could be different for a service provider, different for a medical person, different, but in the end, the process is about control. I want to have control. We even talk about suicide manipulations, and how the attempt is really to manipulate a move. But having said that, you still have to treat each attempt as real because the inmates are also doing that to get attention. So when you don't act on it, they up the game because, hey, well, you don't believe me? Well, now I'm going to really try. And then their foolish actions wind up taking their own life. And no one cares about the other 99 times you saved the inmate. They don't care. They just care about that one time. But overall, it was to really identify the motivations that cause conflict in us, and then basically recognizing it before we start to justify that behavior and it becomes a norm. We kind of also touch on our beliefs. You come in with a set of beliefs, and those beliefs should become habit. These are good beliefs to have. But what the inmates are going to do is they're going to kind of shift that belief. And how they do that is, they try to isolate you from peers, from your support, so they become your resource. They cause animosity. They divide and conquer, whatever it is. And at the end, when you lose those resources, especially as a rookie, that are meant to guide you down the right path, and the inmates come in and they're the ones that become your sole resource, because, guys, when we get into this profession, especially rookies, anytime we deal with an ambiguous situation, we're going to look to others. And we should look to people that we trust. Now, if I'm isolated from my peers, or the inmates have built some animosity towards me and my peers, I'm not going to look to them. I'm going to look to the inmates because we have a bond now. For some reason, I trust them. And next thing you know, the choices I start to make are not really beneficial to the facility. It's not beneficial to me. It's beneficial to the manipulative inmates. So the reason why this book was written is because these are motivations that make sense, that are the process that can happen to anybody, because the game is crafted. It's particular to that person. And the reason why the game can happen to anybody is because it relates to the situations we find ourselves in and how we handle those situations. So I don't care how good you are in this profession. You are going to face novel situations every day, and how you react to those situations are really going to determine, can this happen to me? And if you believe that you're going to react to every situation perfectly, then you're not going to prepare yourself in case an inmate decides to employ that game. So if anything, this game is more to let you know it can happen to you, and just prepare yourself. That's all it is. Prepare yourself, because at any moment you could get chosen. And by the way, when they choose you, it's because there's a vulnerability, because inmates, they want the greatest reward for the least amount of work. So I will guarantee you, when you get chosen, you're getting chosen for a reason. The first thing they look at is they look at the person, and they look to see if the environment will allow me to get that person. That's why communication is key too, Gary, because sometimes you can have staff that's weak, but if they're put into an environment that supports them, that says that we got your back, that weak staff is not as vulnerable as people will think, because the staff will help them. But if you don't have that support, if you don't have that communication, if departments are not trusting each other, I'm custody and I don't trust medical, and I'm medical and I don't trust custody and I don't trust, guys, we're killing each other. And at the end, that vulnerable person, it doesn't matter what department they represent. They become a threat to us all if we allow that to happen. Protect each other.
Yes, you're 100% right. And that's what happens a lot of times. I've mentioned it in several of my videos for different scenarios. I've always thrown in there, pull your partner to the side, watch for things, talk to the officer. You don't have to run off to the supervisor. Pull that officer to the side yourself and say, look, I'm just trying to give you a hint. That inmate's trying to manipulate you. That inmate's trying to make you their friend. And a lot of officers, not a lot, but there's officers out there that think if I make the inmates my friend, it'll make my job a lot more easier. Well, that's not true, because now you've opened the door for them to do all these things you just described. I don't have to go over it. You've opened a door to let them come in and take you over, and now put you in a spot where one day you could be sitting across from a warden saying you're terminated today.
Yeah, you know, 100%, Gary, because the funny thing is that this book was definitely needed, but, having the Tier Talk channel, and I think I'm very close to 15,000 subscribers. This is me telling them that I'm not perfect. A lot of people that follow my channel, especially new boots, they trust me. You become, Gary, you too, you're an influencer. So you have to be very careful of the information that you pass out, of course, because you're going to have some people that don't have the experience to compare and contrast. So they're going to kind of take what you have at face value. But I want people to know the reason why this book came into effect is because I was smart enough to know I don't know everything, and I'm human. And at the end of the day, I never walked around saying I know everything. I don't. The channel, the platforms that we have, we bring the voices that have that expertise. And then obviously through the amount of interviews you do in videos, you learn a lot. But you never take claim for it, because that's their area. They work it, they experienced it. To write this book, I had to admit, because there's vulnerabilities here, But if I didn't admit it, if I didn't believe that this could happen, I think that it would have been a disservice to this profession. This is going to be my legacy, guys. Whether I keep on writing books on manipulation, only because one thing I feel it's needed, but I think in my profession, this is the one thing that's the most misunderstood. I don't think people understand how dangerous this game is, not even the public. I think they minimize the intelligence of the inmates. And I think sometimes it's crazy, guys. Have you ever done a search of a cell And when you do the search of a cell, you see this inmate reading all these books, and you still want to call the inmate stupid. You know, I don't know what the motive is. Maybe some are trying to better their life. Don't get me wrong, but some may not. Some may be reading these books to better themselves because they have a life in prison. And the more educated they get, the better chance they can have at employing a game. So even with the 48 laws of power, inmates were reading it. I'm going to read it because there's got to be something in that book that I feel has use to their life here. And at the end of the day, whatever that use is, I don't want to be that use. So, you know, I think the big part of it all is that I wanted people to understand that you're vulnerable. And I'm telling you right now, this book was born because I felt at one point it could have happened to me. I'm not perfect. So for people to think that it can't happen, then you're the ones that get caught up. Because even being that extra hard officer that everybody talks about, the one that always goes to policy and procedure, is also seen as weak. Because at the end, policy and procedure becomes the backbone, and you may not have the ability to adapt and adjust. The people that maneuver in this profession, and by the way, guys, it takes time, it's not perfect, are the ones that have that discretion. They can employ it. They have that ability to adapt and adjust. And we're not expecting that on your first couple of years. This is your time to be an apprentice. But I'll tell you something, guys. The reason why experienced officers survive this profession, it's not based on 100% policy and procedure. I'm not saying they violate it. It's not what I'm saying. But it's based on how they can maneuver, how they can bring things back to policy and procedure. And that truly comes from experience, developing discretion, and taking control. Because at the end, if the inmates can manipulate policy and procedure, and that's what you live by, then they can manipulate you. So you have to have a way to say, well, let me sit back because this inmate's expecting me to do this. Why? Because policy and procedure says that. So now let me just have a little bit more control in that response. Let me not just go right at it. Let's come up with a game plan. And then again, it's an effort to gain some level of control.
You're so right. And, you know, I always tell people, learn from your mistakes and don't let it kick you in the rear and bring you down. Learn from that mistake, find out what you did wrong, and get stronger. Because I just did a video the other day, and I talked about 2 times when I worked in the state prison, I had 2 days on the porch without pay, you know, years apart, but 2 times. Somebody said, well, why would you even mention it? Why not? I'm not perfect. You said, you know, just like you said, we're not perfect. I'm not ashamed of it. I was saying in the video how each incident that took place was not serious enough to be terminated. A couple of days on the porch to get it in the head. That's what they were trying to do. Send you home 2 days without pay to get it in your head. And now you learn from that. And if anybody out there does, if you're going to do a career 25, 30 years, there's going to be a time when you might run into this. Don't let it knock you down in the dirt. Take your time, take your hit, and then come back stronger than you were before. And just learn from those mistakes and study and get books like this one from Anthony Gangi and try to use all of it. Your experience on the floor, your education from other officers, mistakes you've made, and learn from it and make yourself into a stronger correctional officer or law enforcement officer.
Yeah, you're right, Gary, because at the end of the day, even discipline is constructive.
That's right. That's right, Anthony. Now, could you please quickly, and we'll put in the video here somewhere where they can get the book as well, maybe a link or something in the video, but tell everybody where it's available. I know it's available on Amazon paperback, Amazon Kindle. Before we close, give us places this book can be purchased.
Done really right now is I definitely put it through Amazon. I did have an editor, so this was a costly project. Ran me a couple of bucks to get it done, but it's worth it, guys. This will be my legacy eventually, so it's worth the money. But right now, it could be purchased through Amazon. I believe it's $20 a book. I'm sure Gary could put the link in the description. And I also, if you guys want an autograph copy, then you could order it through my PayPal. Maybe Gary could put that in the description as well. And but mind you, the PayPal, the Autographed copy takes a little bit longer to get to because it has to come to me, and then I have to mail it out to you guys. So when you send it, you got to make sure that I also get your shipping address, and that will be for the signed copies. And I believe the signed copies are $25, and the reason why they're $5 more is it will help me with the shipping, because I'm going to have to also ship it from, you know, my address back to whoever's getting the book. And if you're out of the country, because I do have some purchases in the Netherlands and Japan and a couple of places, it's only going to be $25. Whatever the cost is outside of that, I'll cover it, because, you know, I it's worth it to get the information out there. It's worth it. So, you know, if it costs more to send it out there, I don't care. I will send it out. So just keep the price consistent at 25. I'm not expected to be a millionaire. The key here, guys, is that to get the information out there. And that's the reason why the book was written. The intent was to help the profession.
Listen, we appreciate it very much. I think that this is something that everybody should order, but I think everybody needs to see this video and listen to some of the discussion we had. And this should give you a great idea of why this book would be good to purchase and to help you in your career. I had 28.8 years in the profession. I just retired 24 months ago, and I'm going to read the book because I go around and I talk to people in other states. I talk to people on my YouTube. I'm invited sometimes. I just did an interview with a German journalist who wanted my opinion on some things that are happening in prisons. And I need to continue to educate myself. So I'm still doing it at this age and time and point in time in my life. So, Anthony, thank you very much for being here today with us. And thank you for the information. And we'll get this out to as many people as we can.
Thank you for having me, Gary. I just texted you the link for the PayPal. And guys, as always, guys, please stay safe. And Gary, again, just a big fan. I love what you do. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And you take care. See you next time.